interested and came out to take care. So, you know.
All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to remind you, the restrooms are right around the corner. We've got water up here, and if anyone wants a refill of their turmeric milk, it is right here as well. Thank you all so much for coming out today. My name is Lauren Welsh. I'm one of the co-founders of Thread ATL, along with Matt Garbett and Darren Gibbons, who is right over there. You know, when Lori approached us with this idea of an intervention at the 0 mile post, of course, we were thrilled to try to connect together on that. You know, for me personally, I have been obsessed with GLOW since the day they started, and the idea that I'm now standing here doing some sort of collaboration with Lori and her dancers is absolutely incredible and inspiring to me. But the reason we wanted to do a conversation is because we wanted to try to talk a little bit about the city of Atlanta and our lack of value that we seem to place around our history, our story, our past, where we've come from, and how that shapes our current identity. As a city, we seem to talk a lot about really big, fancy projects that we think will kind of define our city. But that allows us to do things like destroy the oldest African-American Baptist church in our city for a new stadium. That allows us to have something like the 0 mile post, which is literally the mile marker for Atlanta when it was called Terminus, when it was first started, is now sitting in a building underneath a parking deck that is fenced off and locked by the Georgia Building Authority. And it is actually now gotten to the point where the building authority has said that the building is locked because it is unsafe. Of course, we are now going to try to reach out to the Georgia Building Authority to find out what their plans are for restoration of this historic mile marker, but we'll see where that goes. This is a continued conversation about Atlanta's identity. I think you can see it when we talk about things like Martin Luther King's birth home, and that is where we sort of talk about the civil rights movement at that one home with paint peeling off of it in the old 4th Ward. Yet we do not talk anything about the home in English Avenue on Sunset Avenue where he spent most of his adult life. We have places like Midtown, which are vibrant entertainment and really connected communities that have a lot of history in the LGBT movement that is now really feeling a lot of crunch because a lot of their entertainment establishments have been shut down because of complaints from neighbors. And we now even have someone who recently moved into Midtown who was complaining about a lot of their institutions being too loud. You know, this is at the corner of 10th and Monroe, right? This is the place of Midtown. So how do we place value on these communities, on these stories, on these elements of our past so that they become worthy of protection, worthy of pride, so that those are the things that we talk about and think about when we think about Atlanta. It's not just a stadium, it's not just this idea of Amazon, it's about who we are and where we came from. So that is what brought us today to create this absolutely incredible panel. We've got here, Matt Garbett is going to be doing the moderating for us. We have Rube Bailey, hip-hop artist and a founding member of the Dungeon family. If I don't get any of these introductions correct, please correct me. Maria Saporta, I'm not even sure where to begin with a long description that I could give Maria, but obviously long-time urban affairs journalist in the city of Atlanta, been here as an institution, not just in journalism, but as someone who really has a strong heart for where Atlanta is and where it's going. We also have Jessica Vanlanduyt, who is the Deputy Mission Officer over at the Atlanta History Center. We're going to talk a little bit about the History Center and how it's evolving in its identity to try to connect more communities with our past. And of course, we also have Maurice Hobson, who told me I shouldn't call him doctor, but he is a doctor, so I'm going to say Dr. Maurice Hobson, author of The Legend of the Black Mecca, and his 3-year-old William, who I cannot believe is so quiet, falling asleep like that. My 3-year-old would never do that. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation. And at the end of it, you know, there is no significant call to action. It is just we want to be part of a conversation of placing value on the things that we believe are really more about Atlanta's identity that we don't talk about enough. So, pass it to you, Mr. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. We're just going to dive right in. When we were talking about this event, and this will be the first question, it got me thinking about the 0 mile marker. And you think about the founding mythologies of other places. You know, Rome has Romulus and Remus, and New York City, for better or worse, has the exchange of the trinkets for Manhattan Island. And we are the only city that I can think of whose founding mythology starts at zero. You know, literally, we began from zero and we start from zero. And what does that mean for us as an identity for a city, do you think? And when you look at the history of the city, my opinion is we don't really redefine ourselves very often. We rebrand ourselves. And this starting notion of we started from zero, we still begin at zero, plays a part in that. So I'm going to start with you, Professor Hobson, and we'll move down the line and see if you have a thought on what it means to be a city defined from zero.
You know, I when you were forming the question, I actually began to kind of think in another realm. A couple of days ago, I was watching episodes of The Dukes of Hazzard on YouTube, and I have this trick to where with my students, I'll show the trailer for The Dukes of Hazzard and the theme song with Waylon Jennings, and break down the lyrics of what the song says. And I asked my students, what's the difference between the Dukes of Hazzard and the Black Panthers? Because both of them see the system as a problem, and they're trying to make their way the best way they know how. So the only difference is like phenotypical, you know, white, black, different political orientations, but the problem is the same. And when you said, you know, it started at zero, I was thinking about the General Lee. The car got a 0 and a 1, so they started with 0, then they had 1 car. So I thought you were going in that direction. But what's particular about, historically what's particular about the city of Atlanta is that as great and mighty as it is now, when it was founded in 1847 as Terminus and Marthasville and Thrashersville and all those different things, it was insignificant. It was an insignificant city in terms of what it would be. The big cities in the state were Savannah and Augusta. And so the might of Atlanta's growth is really the reconstruction and the New South kind of industry. And so from the onset, the industry has always been transportation. And that's how it's able to grow, and it's always been a hub of different kind of folk and different kinds of activities. But with that being said, I have a really good friend in doing interviews, and he once ended an interview by saying, Atlanta is like a top-priced athlete. If you have the money, it has the time. It's everything to everybody. And a jack of all trades is a master of none. So my thoughts is the city has a very difficult time defining what it is, who it is, and how that plays out to all of its populations.
And, excuse me, you two as historians of the city as well, you know, looking at the rebrandings that Atlanta has gone through over and over and over again in relation to that, do y'all would like to hear your comments on the question and that?
I think it's interesting thinking on the concept of zero, and that it was this terminating point, right? The termination, the end of a thing, which at that point was a termination of a lot of early 19th century, a lot of cultures, Creek and Cherokee change, but then at the same time it signaled this new beginning for this part of the city or the state, this new cultural landscape that came up from this terminating, this end point, and the fact that it was just this little kind of cobbled together bit of shacks supporting this termination, and all of this kind of began to grow out of that. As far as the rebranding, that's what I just did for you. I rebranded it from the end point to the beginning point in a lot of ways, and that's what Atlanta keeps doing with itself, is that opportunity, that progress that it creates for itself. The idea of moving forward, not backwards.
Maria, big Rube?
I go way back. So I was born in Atlanta in 1955, and I think of this area when I was growing up. My mother started a school, the Alliance Française, here at Whitehall and Martin Luther King, which before was what street? I forget what MLK.
West Hunter Street.
Huh?
West Hunter.
West Hunter Street. So I would go visit her. They had a manual elevator, beautiful building, torn down for one of the underground parking garages, I think. And I would go and walk to Terminal Station. I loved Terminal Station. It was like a castle when I was a kid. It was, you know, in the 60s, go visit. I made friends with a woman who worked at one of the stores at the station. It was clearly past its prime, but it still had something amazing. And that's, I think, the soul of Atlanta was in its old railroad stations, and we tore those down. So I think part of when I think about Atlanta, I think about the lost soul that we have, and how we are always trying to redefine or find our soul. And I think we have been somewhat successful in a couple of areas, but there's so much more to do, and we have to continually defend whatever soul we have left.
Well, I think symbolically, if you look at even the structure of Atlanta, so different from originally, and even, you know, the medium point, because we grew up learning that, you know, Atlanta got burned down, and then it was too lazy to like rebuild it for real, so they just kind of like put Atlanta on top of Atlanta, so that's why we got underground. That's kind of was like the mental picture that they gave us. And
Can you talk now? Left.
oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The symbolism of it is, it's almost like we're always fighting for respect from other cities. You know, with major hub, you know, and as far as being progressive, to be in the deep South of Georgia is about as deep as you can get it, you know, until you get to Florida. You know, Atlanta's pretty tolerable as far as just the overall feel of things. You go to a lot of cities, you know, not even, you know, that's bigger than us, and you don't get the hospitality or the acceptance that you get here. I mean, it's not perfect, but we learned that basically it was almost like the lesson was it's easier to like kind of sweep it under the rug as opposed to fixing the problem. You know, treat the symptom as opposed to treating the disease. And even if you look at the structure of Atlanta, you have like symbolically the zero mile. How she said she flipped it to the end. You look at the zero, it's a circle, which has no beginning and end. It's infinite. And then it's like 285 surrounds Atlanta. You know what I mean? It almost feels like building a wall. You know, and you had different cities that have risen because they wanted to break away from Atlanta because they didn't agree with the municipalities or the government process or whatever it was. And when we was kids, they had this little running joke where they said Atlanta's not a city, it's a large town. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, it's almost like you're always fighting for respect as a whole, as a city. You know, and a lot of times you look at the news and stuff and you see where internally we struggle with things like silly stuff like the name of the airport, or, you know, whether or not they're going to put a stop sign when they have 1,000 accidents. Of course you're going to put a stop sign, put a red light, put 3 of them. But it's like sometimes they don't want to spend the money or the time to do what's necessary to truly rise up. They rather look good than be good. You know what I'm saying? And that's how, and when I say they, I just mean people in administrative power that can really make things shake. And the best example I got for you to end this off with is 285. I'm sorry, 166, which is in my, you know, little access road that you get from get to 75 with from my house. Is to turn the lights off, like you couldn't see. And they didn't turn it back on until Gibbs said, "Somebody please cut the lights on 166. I can't see where the fuck I'm going." You know, it's like that was like, come on, bro. But imagine how much money a city saved just from not running street lights for a month or whatever. You know, in certain areas. In the areas that they turn the street lights off in is the one they really need to put more street lights. You know, so we don't solve problems a lot of times. We just kind of broke, not money at it, but kind of turn our backs on it and ignore it and hope it goes away. And that has been a trend since I was a kid, at least in my perception.
So to follow up on all of what you said, a lot of Atlanta's history and its places have been sacrificed oftentimes in the self-promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And we're gonna get to the places soon. And when y'all were talking, it reminded me of the chapter in your book about the Atlanta child murders. And who here is familiar with the Atlanta child murders? This crowd's probably gonna have a lot of hands, but a lot of people aren't. So I lived here for 10 years before I'd ever heard about it. And so from 1978 to 1980, about.
I would actually argue longer.
Okay.
I do argue longer. But,
Well, for over a period of several years in the late 70s and early 80s, 30 to 46 perhaps children were murdered. And during the time, they're African American from low-income communities in Southwest and West and Southeast Atlanta. And the prevailing sentiment at the time was that the city and the Mayor Jackson were more concerned with maintaining Atlanta's nationwide status as a place to come and less concerned with solving the crimes. And obviously the two are not comparable, but you look continuously now at Atlanta where we've got the stadium being built, and we're more concerned about the stadium than necessarily we were about the effects of that on the area's history and the people that live there. We sold Fort McPherson to Tyler Perry, and we're more concerned about having Atlanta continue to be a major movie hub to broadcast to everyone to come to us than we were about the communities. And that idea that places in history are subservient to the promotion of Atlanta rather than to the continuation of Atlanta is something I'd like your thoughts on. I'm going to start with Maria on this one because I'm going to mix it up the whole time.
Okay. Well, I mean, let me pick up from where I was with the terminal station and Union Station. When I was growing up, one of the favorite things my parents used to do would be my father would drive us to one of the train stations, to terminal station, and we'd say a big goodbye. And we'd play out this whole thing. There wasn't a lot to do in Atlanta in those days, so this was entertainment. My mother and my sister and I would get on the train, and we would ride over to Brookwood Station. They wouldn't ask you for a ticket for that little stretch. And when we'd arrive at Brookwood Station, my father would be there to welcome us, and we'd play the whole game. Oh, how was your trip? You know? And it was, you know, I've had a love of trains my whole life and a love of rail. And there was a time when Atlanta had extremely extensive streetcar network that went everywhere, to Hapeville, to Marietta, and these streetcars really helped define. Atlanta has always been defined by transportation and communications, and I think that we have not respected the forms that were there, that built the city and created it. So, and now, you know, I'm very troubled that we're looking at a development that will, with the Gulch, that will erase even more of that past.
Dr. Hobson?
What was the question? I mean,
the way our history is, you know, starting from the Atlanta child murders up to now, where anything that's happening in the city is subservient to the political elite as to promotion of the city to an outside force, you know, as self-promotion, and how that impacts us is how we see our history and the buildings that we are willing to sacrifice as well.
So in the field of history, there is a continuous debate that states that, like, history is cyclical, so like history repeats itself or people repeat history. So we can't quite figure out which one it is, but we know that what happens again over a period of time.
The first time it's tragedy, the second time it's farce.
Right, or as W. Bush would say, first time shame on you, second time shame on, well, don't do it no more, you know, whatever. But, and I say this because when we begin to talk about like political economies of cities and how political economies push policies, money pushes policies that create more revenue and capital. So that's capitalism at its finest, and it can manifest itself in all kinds of different ways. But you take an incident like you take an incident like the building of the Georgia Dome versus the building of Mercedes-Benz Stadium versus the building of Turner Field versus the building of Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. In 2014, former mayor of Atlanta made the statement that Atlanta would never burn like Ferguson, Missouri. And that was about the imagery of Atlanta being this like most inclusive city. And Atlanta does have some great aspects. And I listened to that and I said, clearly this former mayor doesn't know history. In 1966, when Fulton County Stadium was being built, there was a real showdown between the Summerhill community, overwhelmingly black community, and the government and business district of downtown. And so there was a little area called the Washington-Rawson neighborhood, which was a slum, and so they cleared it. And one of the things that Ivan Allen had done was that he ran on a platform saying that he would bring a stadium to the city to make it a real kind of an entertainment sports kind of complex. In the process, it became a place where the police would over-police black communities. What happens is a police officer shoots a man by the name of Harold Prather in the back and kills him. And all hell broke loose. And this is known as the Summerhill Rebellion. Some would call it the riots. I say rebellion because when you say rebellion, it speaks to an issue of plantation politics and a system that is exploiting and all kinds of different things. But what happens is every police officer in the state, in the city of Atlanta were on duty, but 75% of them were there to protect the stadium, not to bring peace. And so what we're presenting is Atlanta's greatest asset. I mean, yeah, it's known for transportation, it's known for all these different things, but Atlanta's greatest asset is boosterism. It can present itself as being anything. And when history works to buttress this idea of image and doesn't remember or understand the inclusive nature of what things are, it will always come back to haunt it. And so to speak to the conversation, you know, in terms of things like the Atlanta child murders and how it was swept under the rug, I have evidence that there were probably 200 victims that lasted over 10 years, and they even lasted after Wayne Williams was put into jail. There were several killers. A lot of that is detailed in the book. There was a particular list that was created to target a particular kind of killer. And the problem with it is that the mayoral administration at the time, Maynard Jackson's administration, said that these kids were hustlers and runaways. So one of the things I do in my research is I distill what the hustle was of those children when they were killed, and most of them were collecting aluminum cans or doing tobacco runs for their elderly neighbors or sweeping up in barbershops. They were just kids trying to get money to watch kung fu movies and play video games and buy hamburgers at the varsity. And so the thing about it is that kind of episode was a black eye on the city's image, nationally and internationally. And so they swept it under the rug. And it does show that, it shows an issue that W.E.B. Du Bois kind of lays out in one of his chapters in The Souls of Black Folk called Of the Wings of Adelante. And I'll make reference to that a little bit later.
And to follow up on the comments about the stadiums too, I mean, it's important to remember that thousands of people were displaced from Summerhill to construct the original Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. When the Georgia Dome was built, thousands of people were displaced from a neighborhood that no longer exists called Lightning. So there's a whole entire neighborhood ceased to exist to brand ourselves as a world-class city through these sporting events. And how are we, and I'm going to give this to you, Jessica, you know, what role do you have in maintaining, in all different roles, as historians, Atlanta History Center, as a rapper, as a journalist, informing people in Atlanta about this history, not just to the ones that are interested in it, that, you know, willingly go to the Atlanta History Center, but how do we get more people to be aware of this outside of the people that are choosing to come to an event like this?
What's the power of place, right? The sense of place. And I like to think, with what I do, I spend a lot of my time in the past, but I don't want to live in the past. I want the past to live with me now. I want it to be around me. I want to be in conversation with that, and whether that's the landscape, whether that's artifacts, you know, the very 3D things in front of us, or whether it's those ideas and conversations like this that open our minds and challenge us to think about those kinds of things and how we've covered up, how we're boosters, how we're this, how we're that, and how we've changed over time. The idea that the Atlanta History Center as an institution of Buckhead has done a very good job of doing history for some people for a short amount of time, and then thinking really of who Atlanta is now, and that we are now history, right? We are the creators of history at this very moment. And so as we think about history, that it's not the past. How many people are from Atlanta? How many grew up in Atlanta? That's a pretty common thing, right? I don't know very many people who grew up in Atlanta anymore, right? But the Atlanta History Center and these sorts of conversations help us to consider that we are part of Atlanta's story now, right? We are part of that discussion, and those buildings that are here now, the ones that we've left up and the ones that remain and the ones that come in the future are going to be part of that story. And we need to have these conversations, and we need to have that landscape and that culture informing us as we move forward. Otherwise, we're going to booster ourselves right out of who we are again.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to put an anecdote to what the professor had to say. At that Summer Hill Rebellion, Mayor Ivan Allen went down there and actually stood on top of a car and pleaded with everyone to calm down. Now, that was an Atlanta moment.
Yeah, that was.
And I think that where Atlanta can take pride, that it's not all, and we can question his motives, but Atlanta has had actually a very good record of when, you know, when the moment of truth is here among us, we tend to do the right thing. And that was, and I mean, I want to, everybody knows, or a lot of folks know about the Martin Luther King Nobel Peace Prize dinner, that at first the community was turning its back on King, and then the business leadership led by Coca-Cola insisted that everyone show up to this dinner. It ended up being one of the most amazing dinners in Atlanta's history. You know, I think it was at the
Piedmont Driving Club.
No, was it the
Answer.
Dinkler Plaza or at it was anyway. It was a room full of people, totally integrated Atlanta, and it and the pictures of it, and there's some footage of it. Really shows it was a special moment in time. So I think, you know, yes, we are guilty of being boosters. We are guilty of trying to rebrand ourselves every which way. But we also do have something that I believe exists in our core, in the city's core, in the city's DNA, that really looks to try to create an oasis in terms of relationships among people. Don't always get it right, always have problems, but again, I think, you know, whether it was Maynard, whether it was Ivan Allen, Hartsfield, you know, we've had a great run of some incredible mayors who would make sure that when the moment mattered, that Atlanta took the right approach. And so the Ferguson riots that were happening, why did it not happen here? I think a lot of it had to do with having a much better trained police force, one that is somewhat reflective of the existing population.
I don't know, but let me,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I hear exactly what you're saying, but I'm going to operate from a perspective of a historian that most times the public don't see. So being a historian, what we work in is a framework called historiography, and then you add theoretical frameworks. Historiography is kind of the canon of history. It's how there are certain branches of literature that have been written and how it is grappled with. And so if I said the word civil rights, mostly everyone in this room would think immediately to Dr. King. That is a very whitewashed, sanitized version of civil and human rights, okay? The new theoretical framework oftentimes history is presented as 1954 Brown v. Board of Education to 1965 or 1968 with the Voting Rights Act coming out of Selma or the assassination of Dr. King. But the truth of the matter is that within black communities, the black masses saw the civil rights movement as really this middle class movement which left out the black masses. And so, much respect to Dr. King and everything that he did, but for the black masses, Dr. King was not the leader. He was one of many leaders. The main leaders in the black community were the groundswell leaders, like in this city, Dorothy Bolden, someone that would really organize and do some different things. And so, Hartsville, we got to also talk about the Atlanta Negro Voters League, founded by John Wesley Dobbs and A.T. Walden. And in the process of this, you got to understand the national implications. There was a Supreme Court case, King v. Chapman, coming out of Columbus, that strikes down the all-white Georgia primary. So what happens is, when this happens in 1946, the creation of the Atlanta Negro Voters League becomes increasingly significant because when this happens, you got 1.2 million black voters that now white politicians have to court to get in office. And so when the Atlanta Negro Voters League is founded, it is ran by 36 of the most prominent black men, not women, black men in the city. And they were the gatekeepers. And when Maynard Jackson decides to run for the Senate in 1968, he was ostracized because he did not kiss their rings, but his grandfather created the system. So what I'm saying is there are class dynamics that take place within the black community and that the masses don't see. And so this is not to say that Atlanta is not a unique place. But the city too busy to hate was to present Atlanta as not being Birmingham or Selma, Montgomery, or Little Rock. And the money would flow because then the federal government says, well, Atlanta's the poster child. So there's even a level of boosterism in that. I would argue that Atlanta's not a civil rights cradle town. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't have any civil rights activity, but the way in which historians measure this is through legislation. And we'll talk about that. I mean, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, what that buttresses and how that works. So
to tie these in together, there are disparate Atlantas, and talk a lot about disparate classes, African American, lower middle, upper income classes, and places. And one of the things that is important is, and everyone watched Atlanta on FX last year, you know, that shows a place. And that you mentioned in the book, one of the things that y'all did in the Dirty South rap movement was there's a visceral sense of place. You know, you start off the album with, hello, this is your captain speaking, and you pointing to the Georgia, this is the dome, it still flies the Confederate flag. Yeah. So, you know, there's a visceral discussion of the physical locations in East Point, College Park, and SWATs in your work. And we're starting to see that through popular culture, but we also repress it. You know, when we broadcast the pictures of Atlanta, we show the Mercedes-Benz, the Georgia Dome, we show Midtown, Buckhead. And so we have these competing things going on, and they all are tied intimately to place. And so I'm going to ask you all to follow up on that, but I also do want to say, in response to both, obviously this is not here for us to bash Atlanta and say we never do it right. No, I mean, by the show of hands of how many people were born here, obviously most of us have chosen to make this our home. So this is a conversation about a city we do love and want to keep making better, not not to say it's bad. And I don't think you were doing that.
Yeah, none of us. I mean, as a native, I have a love-hate relationship with Atlanta, and I'll just start there.
So I mean, talk about bringing attention to how you talk about places.
Just kind of put a highlight on what you were saying. We have this thing when we say, "I'm not from ATL, I'm from Atlanta." You know, some people from ATL, they ain't from Atlanta. You know, they don't know nothing about no Atlanta. You know, people from Atlanta don't even come downtown. Everybody downtown ain't winning. People tend to like, the contrast is this. It's the difference between pride and vanity. Wow. Simple as that. People that are proud to be from Atlanta, like you said, they talk about these points, they talk about the real civil rights movements, they talk about the things that have been done that maybe you wouldn't be so proud that it happened, but it's the truth, and you don't want it to happen again, because what makes history repeat itself is the fact that nobody ever remembered it happening in the first place. So as far as the new people are concerned, it's the first time. Like the first time. and the other first time. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like
no one talks about the 1992 riots downtown
Right,
after
right.
the Rodney
Yeah,
King
right,
verdict.
right.
And
Which was a right.
And there's
Yeah.
a lot
It
of
was.
people
It's
that
in the
are
middle
full
of it.
grown now that weren't born yet. So if you didn't tell them how they gonna know, if you didn't record that information, it's I always use this analogy of human beings haven't really evolved in our, biologically that much in the past couple 100,000 years. Pretty much the same. The difference is the information, the amount of knowledge that we have, and how we use it. Now, okay, a guy creates fire, and then he teaches somebody how to create that fire. If he never taught anybody how to do it, then everybody has to discover for themselves for the first time. History is the same way. If you don't record, it might have been bad. Nobody wants to kind of like delve into those bad things. But if you don't record it and make it known and really, make it real for the people that weren't even alive yet, it's gonna happen again because there's no origin point of your emotion to care about it. How can you care about something that they cover up? And really, like, just being honest here, why we got a new state? The Georgia Dome was built, when I was a teenager.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, usually football stadiums last a little longer than that. You know what I'm saying? I know Putnam is older than the Dome. So they ain't rebuilt those. They ain't rebuilt the schools just falling apart. They're much older than the Dome.
So you literally say cover it up, and I mean.
Literally. I put it to you like this.
Yeah.
There's a street called Stewart Avenue that's not Metropolitan.
Yeah.
There's a street called Bankhead that's not Hollowell. And I'm going to tell you why they changed those names. Because tourists have heard bad things about those names. Now, you can do two things. You can go in there and actually do something about the bad things, or you can change the name so people from our town don't know what my town don't know what the hell they at. But guess what? You still gonna get robbed. It's just that now you get robbed on Metropolitan. It doesn't matter what the name of the street is.
I live 2 blocks from Metropolitan.
You go down my street, it turns into deal, and then bam, Metropolitan. So believe me, I was born in it was a hospital called Holiness Family, which is Southwest Atlanta Community Hospital, which is now DFACS or whatever. But my point is, if you simply try to slap a coat of paint on it, because there's rust there, that rust is still there. You have to get rid of the rust, else the rust will come back through the paint again. You got to paint it again and again and again. You measure twice, cut once. Instead of trying to be present yourself as what you maybe one day hope to be, but you're that now, to compete with cities that are older. And Atlanta in late 70s, early 80s, there's no way you compete with New York or LA. You can't do it. New York was a big ass city with millions of people living 100 years before that. So you can't do it. So the perfect physical and real world practical example of how we cover shit up is right out here. You go in there, you can go down there and eat a hamburger on the old Atlanta street that they make look all nice. But then you look at the news, and it's a parking garage collapsing with people in it. And then they say, oh, we got to fix the infrastructure. Okay, you waited 100 years to fix this giant infrastructure that's got water leaking in it. I live on a street where in Southwest Atlanta, if you look at the way the city planners did the streets and stuff, it's obvious that it was maybe battlegrounds and church warfare type stuff in the Civil War. Whereas now when they build stuff, they just go in there and flatten it out and build it how they want to. Back in the day, they kind of had to work with the terrain. And I don't know if anybody knows what Peyton Road is. And they got like a whole bunch of those little guardrails because the street does this the whole time, but it's like, okay, that's fine, but this is the thing. I live in an area where, since I was a kid, I thought there was a stream there. It was a leak in a pipe. So one day the stream, and it was kind of like, it wasn't a leak in a pipe, it was like an overrun from like some creek or lake or whatever that's in the woods, but it's like, you thought it was this natural thing, one day it just started like, what happened? Oh, they came, and fixed it, but it's like, how much has that eroded?
But that,
it's running under there, you know what I'm saying? Water is,
but that pipe probably was once a stream that they put in a pipe.
Well, it's an overrun.
Yeah.
It's a spillway
but
what I'm saying is it ran continuously for years. And then when they came and stopped it, it was almost like, is there something wrong now or was something wrong the whole time?
So,
like, this lady thinks she's got a little pond, a little stream in her yard, and it really is just, dirty.
Yeah.
You gotta fix the thing that's wrong.
So you kept talking about covering up the past and building
Right.
over it, and painting over it and that sort of thing, and I think something that Matt or Lauren brought up at the beginning is Midtown and the current controversy and activity around noise complaints and ordinances and such for the LGBT community. I spend a lot of my time in Midtown. One of our properties is there, and that's, as my very ambiguous title as Deputy Mission Officer, means I get to put my fingers in whatever I want. And so one of my responsibilities is that campus. You'll probably know it as the Margaret Mitchell House. You should start hearing it very soon as Atlanta History Center Midtown, because we're working on a project where that single narrative of Margaret Mitchell House, we've gone with the wind, and we've got work to do in that area certainly, but we have property. We have a significant amount of property from Midtown and are in an area that is changing every day. I drive there and there's a new hole in the ground every day. There's something changing going on in Midtown, and so the idea of creating this campus there is to do that thing that we were kind of talking about, is how do we connect the people of Atlanta with our past, especially that a lot of folks are new to Atlanta, or I grew up here and only learned some of these things about the city in college. I had to be specifically taught, because it's not in our curriculum in the state of Georgia, to talk about Atlanta as a place, really. And so this kind of campus is this idea of placemaking and working with Midtown Alliance to some extent, but really thinking about the people who live in Midtown now and connecting them to just the very recent past. Connecting them with the places around them, because it's so rapidly changing and things are redefined or covered up or repainted. And it's very exciting to be in that area and to be in this group that's worried and thinking about placemaking, that's thinking about good urbanism. But we created a program called Hidden Midtown. And we take themes each month and we do a scavenger hunt using our archival resources, our photographs of Midtown, and the very recent history. We have one coming up in the spring. It's the 50th anniversary of the publication of Great Speckled Bird, which was happening right there next to us, which is something that folks living in that part of town, no idea about where the LGBT community comes from, about the counterculture and hippies that were there. The first gay pride parade, the first in the country, was right there. And this idea of uncovering, so when our community walks the streets around them, that they see all of this new construction and development, but they also see those historic buildings and understand that fabric, understand that full story of Midtown that is so complex and so really cool and fascinating. They feel a part of that and ownership in that. So that's not so much about covering up, it's just this transformation of idea of what it is.
And what I meant by that was, okay, to me,
Yeah.
tearing down historical landmarks is covering it up. When you have something physical and real there,
Yeah.
people that don't know the history of it, they have something that they can identify with, and it's like a mnemonic device or something. It's like you smell, whatever smell in your grandma's house, you smell like that. It makes you remember. But if you see like a historical landmark, you may ask questions about it. Whereas if nothing was there, you didn't ask no questions about it. So if it's historically pertinent, it should be protected. I mean, that's pretty much what historical landmark laws are for, right? I think the problem is that if you feel like advancing fast or whatever, or looking a certain way is more important than where you came from, you wouldn't be here if you didn't come from there to advance. So of course you got to advance, but not at the sacrifice. It's just like you don't want to pollute the air to have better machines. You don't want to pollute the water, to have factories or, but that's what we do. We sacrifice the greater good or the big picture for the right now. It's just like instant gratification. And to me, one of the biggest things that we did in Atlanta, and when I say we, I'm just talking about the overall one of the biggest things that they did was that whole "it wasn't that bad" type. It wasn't as bad. People, it wasn't that bad. It was 100 years ago. You're like 30. It could have been that bad. Yes, it could have. And if they would have really explained it to you, you'd understand. I can read in a book all I want to, but I don't feel it the way that the people that really have something tangible. Now, of course, if I wasn't alive, I can't experience it. But if there are these kind of things that still have, I believe in energy and, being transferred and left. You can walk and play, you can feel the energy sometimes.
Well, and I think that, and
But you know, if the building 5 hours old, there ain't really a lot of energy in that field.
to tie this back to the beginning and have everyone make a final comment and then open to questions, is that was the intent, I think, of what Lori's vision of this week was, and if you got to participate in it at all, is that, you know, they brought the dancers in to highlight us and make us focus on the places we were standing in. And they took us to the 0 mile marker post, which is 30 feet underneath us, about 100 yards that way, that many, I mean, you're all weirdos. You're here for a reason. This is, and how many of y'all had ever seen that building before, or know, or have seen it yet? I mean, who still hasn't seen it? So we, you know.
If I did, I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, and you know, using her art in the moment to make us aware of our space and our history that's there is great. And then each of y'all in your own way, through your history books, through your journalism, through your the History Center, through your rap and spoken word, are doing that. So how can everyone else be part of this conversation and in their special, in their own way, following from what you have done and learned about bringing awareness to our history and our space? And I'll take the comments on that. And anything else you want to mention, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Well, somebody else can go. Somebody else can go, because I'm trying to frame I want to frame a quote with the final thought. So I'm trying to figure out.
So who wants to go first? So everyone please follow Thread ATL and gloATL on Facebook and on our websites. Please follow the Saporta report in the Atlanta History Center. Buy a copy of Black Mecca and go see Big Rube when he speaks and listens to his albums. Does that give everyone time to think?
Yeah. So let's look at it like this. I wanted to finish. My final quote is, it comes from the Souls of Black Folk. If many of you all know it, Dr. William Edward Burgard Du Bois lived here from 1897 to 1910, where he was brought here to found a center that studied black life at Atlanta University, which was it was the premier university in the state of Georgia at the time. So, I mean, beats out flagships and all that kind of stuff because of how it was funded privately. And in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903, a chapter called Other Wings of Adelante, Du Bois makes a statement and he writes, "Such are not men of sturdier make. They have Atlanta turned resolutely towards the sun. Atlanta, queen of the cotton kingdom. Atlanta, gateway to the land of the sun. So the city crowned her hills with 100 factories and stored their shops with cunning handiwork to greet the busy Mercury, and the nation spoke of her striving." What he describes is Atlanta in this New South environment, this Henry Gray New South environment. But then he pivots and he makes a statement, and he says, Atlanta reminded him of the Greek goddess Adelante. Adelante was a goddess that would only marry a man that could beat her in a foot race. Men would come from throughout the countryside to ask for her hand in marriage. They would be beaten in the race, and they would be put to death. But there was this one suitor by the name of Hippomenes. And Hippomenes really wanted to marry her, so he goes to an old oracle. And the oracle says, well, why don't you lay 3 golden apples along the course of the race? What will happen is Adelante will become distracted by the golden apples, and thus you can beat her, and then you all can be married. So I don't know how you all used to do it in your neighborhoods, but where I'm from, when you would do a race, somebody would say, get on your mark, get set, go, and usually the person that would kick off their shoes would run barefooted with dust, everybody running. So I imagine that happened, and this is what Du Bois writes. She fled like a shadow, paused, hovered over the river, the vale, and the stream, and she comes to the second apple, and she begins to notice its beauty, but she leaves again, and she comes to the third, and she falls in love with the apple. Hippomenes beats her, and they are married, but their love is profane. And then Du Bois says this, if Atlanta be not named for Adelante, she ought to have been, because it's a city that is caught up with greed and mammon and not morality. And when we're talking about morality, we're not talking about highbrow, moral majorative kind of morality. We're talking about working in what's the best interest of people. This is a complicated city. This is liberated territory in a very claret red conservative kind of place. And so I'm not here, and I'm sure the rest of the panelists are, we're not here to bash this place. This is a great place, but it can be better. It can be more inclusive. And we work this kind of policy, we work this kind of history, we weaponize it so that we can make sure that we hold those accountable and let them know we can beat you with intel, we can beat you with data, or we can just rise up on you and get in front of your city halls or on your state capitals, and we'll wait on you to get you there. So that's my closing statement.
Who wants to follow that up?
So I'll say this as part pitch for the Atlanta History Center, but really pitch for the reason you all are sitting here today, is engage and be advocates. And the thing is, the Atlanta History Center is in the first year of a 3-year strategic plan, and one of our core tenets is relevancy, is being a community resource and connector, is showing up where we're not expected. And that is literally, it's figuratively, it's in place, it's in conversations like this, to engage and be part of the culture of the city. And I was talking about how you are the stories, we are the stories. I am Atlanta history now, you are Atlanta history now, and we are all responsible in that way for protecting the history that we have and being part of the culture moving forward, getting the city where we all believe it can go. And it's that love-hate relationship, that push-pull of Atlanta, is having the hard conversations. It's sitting down in dialogue with places around you, with the people around you. And so challenge us as an institution to show up where we're not expected, to be part of the conversation. And we're trying to do that through places like Atlanta History Center Midtown, but through our community partnerships. We have a neighborhoods project. If you live in an Atlanta neighborhood, we've probably begun to touch you in some way and engage in that, because that is not only preserving your history and your stories, but it's helping move those things forward, helping everyone have that kind of civic pride in that place and in the people around us.
I want to bounce off Professor Dobson's comments and say W.E.B. Du Bois was in Atlanta at a pivotal time in its history. The building where he lived while he was writing The Souls of Black Folks, and where being a professor for Atlanta University at the time, is now, it's Gaines Hall. And I don't know how many of you are aware of Gaines Hall. There was a big fire in it. Its roof is pretty much collapsed. It's considered one of the 2 oldest buildings in Atlanta, and we're letting it sit there, deteriorate continually. And I think if we are going to connect, not live in the past, but have the past live in us, these are things that we have to work towards to preserve. And Pascal's Motor Lodge and the restaurant across the street from the new Chick-fil-A Walmart, those are, that is, we may not have been the birthplace of the civil rights movement, but that was the breakfast table of the civil rights movement. That's where the gathering, and I remember going to Pascal's as a kid. We're letting these areas deteriorate, and as a result, just like we lost the train stations, and that helped kill a bit of our soul, we are going to lose more of our soul unless people like you engage and say, hey, we need to save these things that really helped Atlanta go from the little small town that it was to being the big city that it is. And I think as a journalist, all I can do is write about this stuff. It's going to take pressure, community pressure, to really say we are not going to let this stop. And let me just add on to that. Right now, there are so many companies and nonprofits and organizations and people with might who are all targeting the West Side. I mean, this was Arthur Blank and Dan Cathy from Chick-fil-A. They're all saying, you know, we're going to transform, we're going to revitalize the West Side. the danger in this is that if we aren't there protecting what made the West Side what it is, what made Sunset Avenue what it is, we are gonna lose so much, and we may end up clear-cutting our history. And I would just urge all of y'all to be engaged and make sure that we save Gaines Hall and all the other structures, especially on the West End, on the West Side.
Well, you mentioned Chick-fil-A twice, and that made me want some, so I'm trying to tie this thought together that I had when he was speaking.
Let's make you rich.
I'd rather finish this point. I'm just kidding. I mean, I wasn't expecting to perform, but I'll do it. But when he was speaking, when I say cover up, I'm not talking about the city, I'm talking about people who will corrupt and cover stuff up. I mean, because there's a selfish reason to do it. You know, whatever it is, whether it's political power gain or whether it's money or whatever, not losing the position. You know, a microcosm of that is I live on a street dead in Southwest Atlanta, Zone 4, where there's a church, historical church, like 2, 3 houses up from me. It was around during, right after Civil War time. You go over there and read the tombstones, there's soldiers and people, white soldiers and white people, big headstones. They used to have the little Confederate flag on there, and the white kids from there used to steal them. Now, the yards away from that is where they buried the black folks, the slaves. And they either didn't mark their graves or didn't put a headstone, stick or whatever. That's like 100-something years ago, the stick gone. So, as far as I'm concerned, some of our houses on top of people's graves.
Come on, which is desecration.
So if you build a house on top of people's graves, you can do it on purpose. You're doing it because you didn't know they were there. Because they didn't record that they were there. They didn't respect them enough to mark it. So if you don't record the history, you don't respect it. If you don't respect the history, you shouldn't have much hope for the future, because there is no future without a past. So, an interesting theory is that the past doesn't exist and the future doesn't exist yet. It's only the now. Once you get there, it's the present. So protect the present. If you want to be able to pursue happiness and all of this different stuff, a lot of that is tied into knowing where you come from and knowing what's been done, so that it can't be done again if it was bad. Or if it was good, learn how to do it so we can do it more. It's simply just the base, human beings thirst for, like babies thirst for, they want to know what's going on in their nose. It's because that thirst for knowledge in your brains, they just like a sponge. You need to know to be able to advance, or to be able to not make the same mistakes over and over again. Someone else goes through it so you don't have to, or at least so you go in with a knowledgeable, you know what I mean? It's your first time, but at least you had somebody train you. They train people at McDonald's, and it was mandatory to take Georgia history, Georgia culture. I tell you exactly what I remember from the class. Jane Oaks taught the stuff of Georgia. Georgia won the original 13 college. Max Cleveland was the Secretary of State then. I don't know who the hell it is now. And Georgia named after King George, whatever, from England. I know those things because they really drove those things home, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot more stuff they could have drove home.
Rube, you come sit in on my class. I do African American history in Georgia.
Right. I know what you do.
Yeah, we spent some time in the low country. Yeah, I know.
In '85. You know what I'm saying? And like I said, I'm not trying to bash you, Atlanta. I mean, trust me, because I beat you up by now.
I sure will. Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
Serious about it.
You come around here talking that stuff, you know what I mean? Because I'm proud, where I'm from.
Yeah.
But the fact that I'm proud of where I'm from is why I would like to preserve it. Yeah. And when I say preserve it, I don't mean in this kind of old, they don't want to, advance type of way. I just mean preserve the history so that we can benefit from all of the struggles and things that people had to go through. Because that's the point. You don't want your kids doing worse, you want them doing better. Which brings me to my final point, which is the last generation of kids, the first generation of kids ever in the history of this country to not do better than their parents. That speaks to the same thing. Why? Because people cover up everything and they don't understand the importance of it. You know what I'm saying? They say, let's not tell them about that because it's just gonna, it's not gonna be anything good come from that. Yes, it will. You know, because they don't have a knowledge of the truth. The truth, I'd rather hear a harsh truth than a sweet lie. That's my opinion.
All right. Well, thank you to everybody. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have any questions for us? Or y'all just want to mingle and, okay, we got one.
I just want to say that living in Midtown and being here for 11 years, I believe now, and I love Atlanta. As you say, the city's got its great and its bad, but I do love it. It's made my home. I have 2 residents here on Peachtree. I can't tell you now what Peachtree, what ground I'm stepping on in Peachtree, and what is sacred and what wasn't. I used to be able to. I can't tell you now how it's changed so much at such a dramatic pace. I'm a little lost on that. I really am, and it saddens me a little bit because I do love Atlanta. I do. This is giving me such opportunity. But at the same time, the ground that we walk on, we need to know the ground we're walking on. And right now, I walk out the door now. I visited my place on Peachtree, and it's right in the middle of it. It just boggles my mind. The tear it down, build it up, tear it down, build it up. Nothing's being said about what's been torn down and where, what's there before. And you're talking about history, yeah, it's vital to know the ground that you walk on. It is vital. And it's vital going forward. If we're going to make massive skyscrapers and more apartment buildings and more things, we need to have something to say, something to be with what this was about. This is all fabric, you know, whether it's the east side, west side, fucking whatever. This is all made up of Atlanta, and every piece of it has that history of Atlanta. And I'm telling you, I'm a little shocked right now about what's going on in Peachtree and how it's losing any type of history to it. Quickly, so quickly, it's almost
The quickness of it is.
Liliana?
Oh.
Go ahead, Liliana, or Albert.
My question is if our mission is to preserve history, they start with the 0
Can you speak
mile
up?
marker. If the mission is to preserve history and save the mile marker, the 0 mile marker, are there any anecdotes? Who are these souls that planted that marker? Do they have a mission that we want to follow? Do you have any stories about those people in particular that, you know, started this town? Anybody from 1870?
I mean,
They had the original mission.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot like Atlanta today. It's railroad people, transportation people, state legislature, right, business people.
Well, that's all one
They
level.
can't tell you because they didn't record the history of those people.
But
That's
this
why
is,
nobody
but
knows.
this is what we did record. This is what is recorded.
Right.
I just left an event where my job was to show 7th grade social studies teachers how to use primary sources. See, the problem that we have in the United States is that history and the way in which it is taught in our schools is not valid. And it's not even taught correctly. Most people think that history is the memorization of facts and dates. And the facts are fake news. I mean, the same boosterism that promoted Gone with the Wind is the same boosterism that somewhat supports the Black Mecca. So what I'm saying is the way in which we teach our young people history is to take them into archives and primary sources and have them recreate the narrative. It is investigative work. It's bloodhound work. So, I was telling these teachers, my 3-year-old son, my wife just came to get him. My 3-year-old son, I could teach him how to be a world-class historian by the time he is 18. As long as he can read and go and touch primary sources, I can teach him historiographies, theoretical frameworks, and how to frame that whole thing. What makes Atlanta particularly unique is when William Tecumseh Sherman burned the city down. So for all you Falcons fans who say rise up, that has to do with the Phoenix Bird and all that kind of stuff. When it's 3rd and 10 and you rise, all that. So I'm a Saints fan, who that, but never mind.
Discussion over.
Yeah.
Discussion over.
See, I was with you for a minute.
but what happens
I got
is
on red and black.
white missionaries moved to the city to educate these savage black folk. I mean, it's a really racist rhetoric. To educate these savage black folk through the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's what establishes the historically black colleges. So you have to really do real research in terms of churches that have preserved history, particularly in the Sweet Auburn district, and how these black communities begin to organize around this and look at institutions. And so that is very well preserved. But what happens is, so you have this group of newly freed black folk that are moving to the area because there's equal protection and due process under the law, because the Freedmen's Bureau was here, when Tecumseh Sherman set up headquarters in this particular area. So they were safe here. And then you have the creation of these schools, black education, which parlays into black economics with the Sweet Auburn district and the West Hunter Street district, which is now Martin Luther King, to where, and then you have a conversation around black political empowerment and electoral politics. And that morphs this into something different. But there was a school created on Gilmer Street. All of this stuff is public markers on Gilmer Street for black kids. The first school to educate black children in this city is the Storrs School that comes out of the basement of First Congregational Church. The ways in which Booker T. Washington High School, the bond referendum that was passed, where black folk actually got around it to create that industrial high school. It's such an intriguing kind of story when we really do primary sourced research to allow for those that are interested in history to recreate it based on facts, not based on some kind of feelings. And so those are some of the folks that built Atlanta, but then there's a whole other side of it that we don't get. And so it moves out within those distinguished groups that I talked, those splinter groups that I talked about earlier.
To respond to you, yes, Midtown is changing crazily. I don't know if we have an answer for this here. To answer your question, we do need to do what you've asked for, and that's what all of us should be doing, is creating those stories, and to be honest, getting GBA to grant public access to the 0 mile marker, because if people can't see it and touch it and relate to it, then, that's step one, and that was part of this whole intervention. Is if you don't know it's there and you can't ever see it and it's locked away in a building, that is the primary source of our city. So we need to start with that now. Is why is the 0 mile marker not even available to us to start making us ask these questions? Liliana, you had your hand up, so I'm going to you now. Then I'm going to get you, and then everyone's going to come up and mingle, and we're going to have a kumbaya and a hug, okay? Liliana?
We have closing statements.
Yeah, you had closing statements.
Oh, we already.
Hey, one in reference to like what Tom was saying a second ago, but also, I mean, we're mentioning GBA, but my question also lies in the fact that it would appear to me that there's a quote that says that essentially the erasure of culture and history, like the second you do that, the community begins to forget about the history, but the outside world forgets it faster, and then it becomes easier to rewrite it and then monetize it. What we see is a cyclical process where the city seems to be rebranding and reselling the exact same streets and people again and again and again. Like, I don't think that, I mean, I don't feel like a person in the city. I love this city. I think I have tried to prove that time and time again. And we always joke that living in Atlanta is like being in an emotionally abusive relationship. Because you love Atlanta. Atlanta doesn't always love you back. And right now, I mean, this expedited, like, I think what we call it, not expedited displacement. Like, there's this like process where history is being rewritten so quickly, it's being erased so fast. I don't even know if I remember what the archives building looks like anymore. And everything's being taken away so quickly. And we're now talking about our housing program. We don't have a plan. I don't know what's going to happen. I feel like the history of Atlanta has been erased so many times. And the second you erase history, you also erase legacy. And when you erase the people that are the cultural roots of the city, then you have a city that has no identity. And I feel like we're very much in the midst of identity crisis. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we walk out this door and I feel like the city's like a Frankenstein tourist attraction that very much reflects the identity crisis and this conflict that we currently have. That's not reflected in the people that live here, but it seems to be reflected in the people that are bringing the money into the city and trying to make decisions on how to make this a tourist attraction. I mean, Atlanta feels more like a city that's trying to sell birthplace of the civil rights movement rather than defending birthplace of the civil rights movement. And my question is, like, I mean, what do you think needs to be done? Because yes, we just had that housing announcement that happened yesterday talking about affordable housing that's going to be protecting legacy renters, 51 houses on English Avenue. But how are they going to make permanently affordable?
I don't think they, I'm sorry.
I'll take a quick stab. I think that right now, we, in the last year or two, with the work that the Department of Planning, Ryan Gravel, and Tim Keene have been doing with the city design project, is attempting to help build a vision on how we want to grow without losing what we have. And one of the really important pieces is our natural assets, our trees, our streams, daylighting streams, and all that. So that's the urban ecology side, but there's also the historic preservation side. There's also retaining our neighborhoods and preserving our neighborhoods, and yet redeveloping the crappy commercial corridors, and to have density be there and create senses of place. And I do think that if the community rallies behind creating and implementing the city design, I mean, it will lead to zoning, new zoning, land use, tree preservation, tree ordinance, historic preservation ordinances. There's an opportunity that we have now to help make sense of this crazy place we call Atlanta.
All right, last one.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short, but I have a ton of thoughts about this. I guess the first thing I was going to say is I think it's always definitely important when you talk about the history of Atlanta at all to kind of to really just make clear that there are two Atlantas. There are, like, and we really like to fixate on the instances when we integrated, and that's important, and there are a number of things that we've done in integrated ways that were great, but this city is so segregated. And it always was, and it still is. You can see it in the voting map in the last mayoral election. I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, that's just huge. And I mean, I went to Atlanta Public Schools. Of the 10 APS high schools, only 2 of them are integrated. Not like by choice, but just because that's the way the city is laid out. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Georgia historical markers. I think Professor just mentioned that. I mean, you know, people in this room that love history, I love seeing those and I read them. But I guess that program was only in the 50s or 60s, and you know they haven't put any of those up for forever. And I know EJI in Alabama is putting up markers all over to mark sites of lynchings and stuff, and like that is something that we absolutely need to do in this city. I mean, we could put up a marker right now for the Georgia Dome, because like we're saying, this stuff is happening so fast. And we never put one up for lightning, but we could put one up like they'd be on top of each other. I mean, and there's the road, you turn off north side and you're on the Lester Maddox highway. You know, but there's no marker that talks about how Lester Maddox stood in front of his restaurant with an axe and said, try to come in, and 2 years later he was the governor. I mean, there's just so much history. This is the point, is that there's so much history that people don't know. And the hardest thing is being a native, and obviously we all know this is such an immigrant city, and people are coming, and honestly, a huge part of the identity that everyone loves is the music. Outkast especially, the Dungeon Family, like if y'all hadn't made that music, half of the people that come here wouldn't even have a touchstone. Like we all just unify when Spoiled Delicious comes on. It's like suddenly everyone is like perfectly unified. But it's like these people just moved here from Ohio. They have no clue like about anything in the city. So I mean, it's just something I struggle with as a native, but I think it speaks to a lot of stuff that's happening, you know, in the country as a whole, with class and race issues.
Well, just a quick look at what he's saying to kind of ties it. Okay, in Atlanta, bars and stuff have to close at 2:30. It used to be 4 o'clock. There's a reason for that. They usually tell you is that people in Midtown got mad about all the crime and the littering and all that. That's not true.
It was more Buckhead, wasn't it?
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say, brain fart. Buckhead. People in Buckhead, but that affected the whole entire thing. Now, that did 2 things. Segregated LGTB community, because that's mostly what the clubs in that area were. Because a friend of mine and her wife owned, I don't know if you guys know the club, Backstreet Atlanta. Yeah. And it wasn't just a gay club. There was, you know, all types of patrons at that club, and it had a big business draw too. And they basically forced
24 hours. I mean,
you
became a member.
yeah, you get up 10 o'clock in the morning and go get it in. But it's like they forced them out of there for a parking lot.
A lot of people are blushing for things they did at Backstreet. When it was still open.
I might say I'm sitting in the office. You know what I'm saying? But you know, it was a nice
I was
place.
younger back then.
It was a nice place. It was nice people. But my point is, things like that, they do things and we know what they did, but they lie about the reasons for it. And a lot of the things that they do is to segregate. And instead of segregating through color, now what they do is economic. Obviously, if you have a larger mass of quote unquote minorities that are in a certain economic class and they can't afford to live in a certain area, that's automatic segregation. You can't afford it. We don't have any government projects anymore for just that reason. They basically deported poor people from Atlanta, like they was, you know, from another country. Yeah. Seriously, they moved them to Cobb County, Clayton County.
Yeah.
Bus don't even run out there, like they had Benzes and shit. You know what I'm saying? So it's like y'all can't live over here no more. We ain't saying you can't live over here. You got the money, you can. East Lake Meadows is a golf course.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So yeah, so they can at their dinner parties or whatever say Atlanta doesn't have government projects. We don't have slums. Yes, you do. A slum is not a building. You know what I'm saying? It's a mind state.
So Lori's going to give a closing statement now. Are you not anymore? But oh yeah, yes. Okay, we got two more. We got two more comments, then a closing statement. Yeah, I don't want to cut it off.
That there are two Atlantas. There are at least 7 black Atlantas. And what I'm saying is, see, that kind of language comes from the Kerner Report in 1968. That there are 2 Americas, 1 black, 1 white, and they're going in different directions. The mess up of that is they don't even know that there are 7 black Atlantas right now. And we're talking about old Atlanta, we're talking about old bourgeois Atlanta, we're talking about the black masses, we're talking about the international black community, we're talking about the new interlopers who are Southern, who get along with the Atlantans, and then you got the New Yorkers and folks from Chicago coming down who think they're better there because this is not a down south. We're an East Coast city. No, this is straight up down south. So you got all that going on, and that's the misnomer, is that these communities are monolithic. And I'm sure if we go and if we do an analysis of whiteness or brownness or Latinidad is what it's called, we'll see all of those splinterings too. So there are a lot of different communities that make up this community, and so we have to honor all of them. We have to allow for them to exist on their own terms.
Jessica, you raise your hand?
Yeah, I do have a pitch for the History Center, but it's sort of unrelated. So we now have the Atlanta Cyclorama, which is the 1886 painting of the 1864 Battle of Atlanta. It is opening towards the end of this year in Buckhead in its new house. And as part of being better citizens in Atlanta, we are doing a series of community conversations. The next ones are taking place in March. And how we are talking about Cyclorama, we are hearing from each other and really having the community, both people who've never heard of Cyclorama and thought it had something to do with a bicycle, and people who grew up here and have very strong feelings about it. It is problematic, it is fraught, it is lost cause mythology wrapped up in a big painting. And so we want to talk to the community about what your aspirations, what your disappointments would be around that. So I'll stay after class. I will take your email. If you're interested in participating, we will put you on the focus group list, because people that come out on Saturdays and have conversations about things that are difficult are the people we want to hear from. So.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say before Lori says goodbye is that, you know, obviously this is wide ranging. It was a lot of stuff to discuss. Thank you for coming, and whatever way you think you can be involved and engaged, there are so many organizations in the city right now, and so many excellent historians and journalists and history centers and vibrant, you know, arts culture here. Find your passion and give them your time and support and show up and keep doing this. And thank you so much for giving us your Saturday.
Right on.
And have conversation. You don't have to be doing a speech on a microphone. Just have a conversation with other people. That's one way to do it. Hey, it's I've been like waiting on him.
Thank
I've been waiting on
you.
him, but no, seriously, just that one thing. Like you could just be talking to each
He's
other.
gonna
You don't
rap.
have to
Come on.
formally.
Go a little faster.
Quit putting him on the
See, I'm
spot.
the only one to get interrupted because I'm from the hood.
No, it's because we know
I'm
each
just
other
messing
too
with you.
long.
I'm from the hood too,
I'm
brother.
long-winded, I talk too much. But seriously though, you see a guy, you have a conversation, that's the same thing we're doing, it's just not, folks like that, people gotta talk to each other, it's not just the government, so whoever in power's responsibility, it's our responsibility to educate each other too, even if it's just waiting at the bus stop or whatever, in the morning with your coffee in your hand. Don't be afraid to voice your true opinion, it's the truth, nothing wrong with the truth, whether it's ugly or not, that's all that is.
I love my friend Big Rube is here because he keeps it emotional. So
Keep it real.
keeping it real, yeah. Historiographer, I'm a choreographer. I encourage you to stay emotional, to stay on your feet. Your body is your archives. So when you get lost, open your hands. Look at your hands, they have marks on them. So that's why we were at the 0 mile post. It's a mark telling us to open our hands and be generous and bring a strange group of people together. It's glow, so it's always going to allow for otherness and alternatives and strangeness. Those things are valuable to us. But really, I can go on and on. I would love to talk to you about Gaines Hall because our efforts have been around that space for about 2 years. Matthew took me down to 0 mile post 2 years ago. It took us this long. Gaines Hall, I need to move faster because, as Maria said, it's one of those endangered, right? And frankly, humans are endangered right now.
Yes.
And so hence, keep your hands open. You'll got to meet us on the street. That's my language is on the street. It's through bodies. It's through movement. But if you could stand up and pat each other down because it's fun and you're going to feel better. And yeah, thank you so much. This is the dream, having these beautiful minds and big hearts. Primary resources are in that moment, as Big Rube was speaking. Movement, your body's hunger and its instincts, those cravings are based in the now. And it does take you being on your feet, however. Our brains are a part of the body, but our body knows things our brains don't. And so that's why I keep people on their feet. You're on your asses right now. So you're thinking more than doing, and you're feeling less. So stay on your feet. And Atlanta is a place where this is a place where movements have always been fundamental. Movement, the concept of movement. You can put anything you want on the front of it, but I'm a choreographer and I'm here to tell you that movement is a glue. It's your skin, it's your flesh, and it's your mama and your future selves. So, but thank you so much. Please stay in touch and yeah, get some pictures, tag them. Can you give me the last tacky stuff? Can you just pump them up and just do your
Everyone get on your feet, like she said.
Yeah, tag someone down, head to toe. It goes like this.